There it was, a bright red notice taped to my front door, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze like a warning flag I never saw coming. Final notice: mandatory demolition order was stamped in bold letters across the top, the kind of thing you think only happens in nightmare stories. At first I thought it was a mistake, some mix-up at city planning or a prank maybe. But as my eyes scanned the fine print, words like irreparable violations, non-compliance, and unanimous board decision, the knot in my stomach hardened into something colder. This wasn't a mistake. Karen was behind this. Karen Thompson, president of our HOA and self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, had finally made her move. I should have seen it coming. She'd been circling me for months now, nitpicking my house for anything she could twist into a violation. Peeling paint here, historic windows that didn't match her precious aesthetic guidelines there, and now she was trying to erase my home from existence. But what Karen didn't know was that I'd found something, a loophole buried deep in dusty legal records that might be the key to saving everything. And if I played this right, she was about to learn a very painful lesson. Some houses are harder to tear down than others. When I bought the house on Willow Bend, I thought I was finally home. It was the kind of place that spoke to you the moment you stepped through the front door. A century-old craftsman with stained glass windows, hand-carved banisters, and that unmistakable sense of history that made you feel like you were part of something bigger. I'd spent years chasing promotions, clocking overtime, and scraping together the down payment. And when I finally signed the deed, it felt like the reward I'd been working toward my entire life. The neighborhood had seemed perfect, too. Quiet streets, manicured lawns, and neighbors who smiled and waved as you walked by. Karen Thompson was one of the first to introduce herself. She brought over a tray of cookies the day I moved in, told me how excited she was to have someone with such excellent taste restoring one of the historic properties. Back then, I thought she was just being neighborly. Thought maybe she really did care about preserving the charm of our little community. I was wrong. It started small, like it always does. A friendly note in my mailbox about the color of my shutters not matching the approved palette. A suggestion that the original brick chimney might be a fire hazard and that I should consider updating it. I'd done my homework before I bought the house, pulled permits, checked the HOA bylaws, made sure everything was by the book. But it didn't seem to matter. Within 3 months, the letters turned into formal notices. By month 6, I was getting violation citations every other week. I attended the board meetings, thinking I could reason with them. I brought my documents, showed my permits, even quoted their own bylaws back to them. Karen sat at the head of the long oak table, her fingers steepled under her chin, smiling politely as I spoke. But when I finished, she'd lean forward, tilt her head, and tell me how unfortunate it was that I wasn't being more cooperative with the community's vision. And the rest of the board, they followed her lead. Every time. No one asked questions, no one pushed back. It was as if Karen's word was law in this neighborhood. The notices piled up, fines followed, 500 here, 1,000 there. A penalty for the front porch railings being inconsistent with the community aesthetic. A fee because my original wooden windows, the ones that still had hand-blown glass panes, diminished property values. It didn't matter that I kept everything immaculate, that I'd invested my savings into restoring the home's historic features. Karen didn't care about any of that. She wanted uniformity, and my house didn't fit. Then came the letters suggesting I consider a voluntary remodel to bring the home up to modern neighborhood standards. In plain English, Karen wanted me to gut the place, tear out the heart of the house I loved, and turn it into one of the cookie-cutter monstrosities she called progress. And when I refused, the tone changed. The warnings became threats, the fines escalated. She issued a formal declaration of non-compliance, claiming my home was in such disrepair that it posed a danger to the community. I'd expected a fight, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. A final notice, bright red, nailed to my front door like a scarlet letter. 30 days to demolish my home, or the HOA would take action. They made it sound so official, so inevitable. But I wasn't going down without a fight, and Karen didn't know it yet, but I had a card left to play. The morning after the demolition notice, I found myself standing in the middle of my front yard, staring at the house like I was already mourning it. The old oak tree cast long shadows across the porch, its branches creaking softly in the breeze. I ran my hand along the weathered wood of the railing, the same railing Karen had called a hazard in her last violation report. To me, it was the soul of this place. To Karen, it was an eyesore. I walked the perimeter slowly, the way you do when you're not sure if you're saying goodbye or steeling yourself for a fight. Every shingle on the roof, every brick in the chimney, every pane of wavy glass in those front windows held stories. My stories now. I'd spent the better part of 2 years restoring this place, one careful detail at a time, and Karen wanted to rip it all down because it didn't fit her vision of uniformity. But it wasn't just the house she was after. I was starting to realize this was personal. From the moment I politely declined her suggestion to repaint the house beige to match the community aesthetic, she'd had it out for me. At first, I thought it was just another power trip, but no, this was about control, and people like Karen don't stop until they break you. I heard voices then, low, businesslike, coming from the side yard. When I rounded the corner, my stomach dropped. 2 men stood near the foundation, both wearing hard hats and holding clipboards. One of them was pointing toward the roofline, while the other jotted notes. Their truck was parked at the curb, its doors emblazoned with the logo of a local demolition company. They didn't belong here, and they weren't guessing. I watched them for a long moment before stepping forward. They didn't notice me right away. One of them muttered something about load-bearing walls. The other gestured to the backyard like they were making plans for equipment access. When they finally noticed me, their faces shifted in that way contractors do when they realize the owner's home. "Morning," one said casually. Too casually. I didn't respond. I just stared at them, my pulse pounding in my ears. They were already planning how to take my house apart, and if I didn't find a way to stop this, they'd be back soon, with machines. The HOA meeting was held in the usual place, the community center, a sterile room with too much fluorescent lighting and folding chairs that creaked if you shifted your weight wrong. I sat in the back, same as always. It gave me a better view of the crowd, and, more importantly, of Karen. She stood at the front of the room like she was hosting a charity gala, not leading a tribunal. Her blonde hair was pinned up in that tight, meticulous way she favored, not a single strand out of place. She smiled often, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel welcome. "Let's move on to item 5 on the agenda," she said brightly. "The property at 112 Willow Bend." That was me. I felt more than heard the collective shift in the room. Some of the neighbors glanced my way, most didn't. I'd seen these faces at block parties and barbecues, but now they were as distant as strangers on a subway. Karen cleared her throat and held up a folder. After a comprehensive inspection, her voice took on that syrupy tone she used when delivering bad news. "It has come to the board's attention that 112 Willow Bend poses a serious risk to community safety." She flipped the folder open and began reading aloud, quoting from what she claimed was a structural engineering report. I listened in disbelief as she rattled off terms like unstable foundation and severe wood rot, things that were patently untrue, things I could disprove with a single phone call to my contractor. But the room didn't know that. They only heard Karen's voice. Whispers started to rise, the kind that feel like cold water trickling down your neck. I caught bits and pieces. Dangerous, lowering property values, eyesore. Karen let the murmurs build before she reached into her folder again and produced another document. This time, she held it up like a trophy. "And here," she said, "is a copy of the lien we've had to place on the property due to repeated non-compliance and unpaid fines." The papers waved in her hand like a flag. I could see the red stamp across the top. It didn't matter that the fines were baseless. It didn't matter that I'd challenged them in writing more times than I could count. Karen controlled the narrative, and tonight it felt like she controlled everything. I sat there in the back, fists clenched, wondering just how far she'd go to tear me down. I caught her on her way out of the meeting, just as she was sliding her papers back into that pristine leather folder she always carried, the one with the HOA's embossed logo, like a badge of honor. Most of the neighbors had filtered out, whispering in low voices as they passed me by, avoiding my eyes. Karen stood alone in the empty hall, humming softly as if she hadn't just humiliated me in front of the entire community. "Karen," I said, my voice low but steady, "we need to talk." She glanced up, surprised for half a second before that polished smile reappeared. "Oh, Mr. Brooks," she said sweetly. "I thought you'd already left." I stepped closer. "I want to know why you're really doing this." She tilted her head as if considering whether to be amused or offended. Doing what exactly? You know this house isn't a danger to anyone. You've seen the permits, the inspections. This isn't about safety. I kept my voice even, but there was an edge I couldn't hide. So tell me, what's this really about? Her smile faltered for a moment, just a flicker. Then she let out a quiet, pitying laugh. You just don't understand how these things work, do you? She closed the folder with a soft snap, like a gavel coming down. The HOA board was unanimous in its decision. We have full authority over community standards. If we say something is a violation, it's a violation. I felt a tightness in my chest. There's a difference between enforcing standards and pushing people out. Her eyes flickered again, just for a second. I'm preserving the neighborhood, she said smoothly. You're the one who refuses to cooperate. You're holding us back. She took a step closer, her perfume sharp and artificial. You bought a house that doesn't fit anymore. It's nothing personal. Some things just need to be cleared away so the neighborhood can thrive. I stared at her, searching her expression for a crack. But she was polished marble, cold and gleaming. There are rules, I said quietly. And I know every single one of them, she replied, that smirk creeping back across her lips. And how to use them. I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't just following the rules. She was bending them until they broke. The next morning, I drove to City Hall, the demolition notice still crumpled on the passenger seat like an open wound. I'd barely slept the night before, lying awake replaying Karen's smug expression over and over. She was certain she'd already won, certain I'd give up, pack my things, and let her bulldoze everything I'd worked for. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. City Hall was quiet, the kind of stillness that made old government buildings feel like tombs. The clerk behind the records desk barely looked up when I gave her my name and address. She typed it into her system with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. After a few minutes of soft keystrokes and the whir of an ancient printer, she handed me a manila folder filled with papers that smelled like dust and old ink. "These are the property records you requested," she said. I thanked her and found a seat by the window, the folder heavy in my hands. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe some glimmer of hope, maybe a reason to keep fighting. What I found was better. Buried near the back of the file was an easement agreement. It was old, decades old. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting formal and precise. I read it once, then again, the words slowly sinking in. It was an agreement between the original owner of my house and the city. The property had been designated as a protected structure due to its historical significance. More importantly, the easement established certain rights, ones that had been grandfathered in long before the HOA ever existed. There it was, in plain language. The house couldn't be significantly altered or demolished without approval from the city's Historical Preservation Office. Not the HOA, not Karen. And no one had mentioned it because, from what I could tell, no one had bothered to read this far back in the records. I sat there for a long moment, the noise of City Hall fading away. Karen thought she knew every rule, but this wasn't just a rule, it was a law. And if I played this right, it could be the wedge that cracked her whole operation wide open. I slid the folder back into my briefcase and left City Hall with something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. By the time I got home, the confidence I'd felt leaving City Hall had dulled into something closer to cautious optimism. I knew better than to trust a gut feeling alone, especially when it came to legal matters. I needed a second set of eyes on that easement agreement, someone who knew how these things worked inside and out. I made one call, Ben Carlisle, property law attorney. We'd gone to college together, and while we weren't close anymore, I knew he was sharp, the kind of sharp that cuts clean through the nonsense people like Karen wrap themselves in. Ben agreed to meet me that afternoon. We sat at my dining room table, the easement spread out between us, along with the deed and every HOA notice Karen had ever issued. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the pages with that quiet focus lawyers get when they were reading something complicated but familiar. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "This," he said, tapping the yellowed easement, "is your lifeline." I nodded slowly. "But?" He gave me a tight smile. But it's not bulletproof. The easement establishes your rights as the owner of a historically protected property. It restricts what can and can't be done to the house. No demolition, no structural changes without city approval. He paused, then added, but the HOA could argue your house doesn't fall within those protections if they claim it sits outside the original boundaries defined in the agreement. I frowned. Boundaries? Ben pulled out his tablet and swiped through the scanned documents. This easement is tied to the original property lines from when the land was subdivided. If Karen gets a surveyor to argue your house sits outside of those lines, or if they claim the easement was never properly recorded when the HOA was established, it muddies the waters. Muddies, I repeated, but doesn't erase. Exactly. He gave me a steady look. If you can prove your house is still within the original boundary lines listed in the easement, you've got leverage. The HOA can't touch you without violating state preservation laws, but you're going to need solid documentation. I nodded, a plan already forming in my head. I can get it. Ben smiled again, but there was a flicker of warning behind his eyes. Then get ready. Because if Karen realizes you're onto something, she'll come at you harder than ever. I believed him, and I was ready. 2 days after meeting with Ben, things escalated faster than I expected. I woke up to the sharp sound of metal stakes being driven into the ground. When I stepped outside, there they were. Bright orange signs planted across my front lawn like warning flags. Notice of demolition, scheduled date, 2 weeks from today. Below that, in smaller letters, it read, authorized by Willow Bend Homeowners Association. It felt like a death sentence nailed to my property. By noon, a crew had taped off the front yard with plastic barriers, the kind they use when they're about to rip something down. I didn't miss the symbolism. Karen wasn't just threatening anymore, she was broadcasting her intentions for everyone to see. And it worked. Neighbors who used to smile as they passed now crossed to the other side of the street. Some didn't look at me at all. I couldn't blame them. Karen's reach was wide, and no one wanted to be next. I could feel the weight of their silence pressing in on me. But something was different this time. That afternoon, as I stood on my porch watching the contractors measuring for demolition equipment, I noticed 2 members of the HOA board across the street, whispering to each other, John Lewis and Rebecca Hanley, 2 of Karen's most reliable votes. They kept glancing at me and then at the signs in my yard. I'd seen John at past meetings, nodding along with everything Karen said, but today his arms were crossed tight and there was a crease between his eyebrows that hadn't been there before. Rebecca looked the same way. Uneasy. Later that evening, I saw their cars parked in front of Karen's house. The lights inside flickered as shadows moved behind her windows. There was tension brewing. I wasn't sure if it was fear, guilt, or common sense finally kicking in, but the cracks in Karen's little empire were showing. She might have the board on paper, but people were starting to question just how far she was willing to go. I took out my phone and snapped pictures of the demolition signs, the tape, and the contractors surveying the yard. Every move they made went into a folder I labeled Endgame. Karen was pushing harder, so was I. The folder on my desk grew thicker by the hour. What had started as a scattered pile of notices and petty fines was becoming something else entirely, something sharp. I wasn't just fighting to save my house anymore. I was building a case, and the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that Karen had overplayed her hand. It started with the signatures. I cross-referenced every document the HOA had mailed me, the citations, the liens, the so-called board decisions, with the official signatures on file from the HOA's bylaws. Some of them didn't match. Sloppy work. Karen must have forged signatures from board members who either didn't attend those meetings or hadn't agreed to vote. I highlighted each inconsistency, scanned them, and saved them in a file marked *forgery*. Then came the financials. Ben had warned me to look at the HOA's common fund reports. They were supposed to be public record, available to any member who requested them. After a few strategically worded emails, I got access. And what I found made my stomach turn. Thousands of dollars marked as beautification expenses with no supporting receipts. Payments to contractors that didn't exist outside of a P.O. box and a disconnected phone number. Even a transfer labeled consulting fees, paid directly to an account under Karen's name. Misappropriation of funds. Fraud. I added it to the folder. And then there was the pattern. I spent hours going over every violation Karen had issued in the past year. They weren't random, the fines, the threats. They targeted the same types of homeowners, anyone who stood up to her, people who didn't fit her ideal version of the neighborhood, a retired veteran whose flagpole was deemed excessively large, a single mother fined for her kids leaving chalk drawings on their driveway, and me, discriminatory enforcement, clear as day. I documented it all, dates, times, witness statements from neighbors who were finally willing to talk, quietly, off the record, but willing nonetheless. By the time I closed the folder that night, it was too heavy to hold with one hand, and it wasn't finished yet. Karen thought she'd backed me into a corner. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't planning on crawling out. I was going to tear the whole wall down. I woke to the sound of metal clanging against metal. For a split second, I thought it was part of a dream. Then I heard it again. Sharp, hollow, deliberate. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside just in time to see them driving the last steel post into the ground. A black chain-link fence now surrounded the entire front half of my property. The kind of fence you see around condemned buildings. Zip-tied to it were more bright orange signs, each stamped with bold letters. Restricted area, demolition pending, and standing beside the crew was a man in a black polo shirt with a silver badge embroidered on the chest. Thompson Private Security, Karen's last name. He stood there like he owned the place, arms crossed, mirrored sunglasses reflecting my front porch. Behind him, 2 more guards paced along the sidewalk, their earpieces buzzing with chatter I couldn't make out. I walked up to the gate, gripping the cold steel tighter than I should have. "Who authorized this?" I asked. The man didn't answer. He just handed me a folded piece of paper through the fence, another official HOA notice claiming that the demolition was imminent and that the fencing was for public safety. It was laughable if it hadn't been so serious. I called the sheriff immediately, explained the situation as calmly as I could. The forged signatures, the unauthorized demolition order, the private security fencing off my property like they were protecting a crime scene. I could hear the deputy on the other end of the line trying to keep his voice neutral. "It sounds like a civil matter, sir," he said. "You'll need to take it up with your HOA's dispute resolution process." I hung up without thanking him. Civil matter. Karen had them convinced this was all within her authority. And as far as they were concerned, she was just enforcing HOA bylaws. Never mind the forged signatures, the financial fraud. None of that mattered without someone willing to listen. The fence rattled slightly in the wind. I stared at it for a long time, hands in my pockets, feeling the weight of what I was up against. Karen had made herself untouchable. She wasn't just pulling the strings, she was the one who'd built the stage. But I wasn't giving up. I just needed to find a way to cut the wires. By the time the injunction paperwork was ready, I'd gone over every line of the easement agreement 100 times. Ben helped me file it with the county court first thing Monday morning. We knew it was a long shot to get a hearing on such short notice, but something about the urgency must have struck a nerve. By noon, the clerk stamped the temporary restraining order and slid it across the counter toward me. "Effective immediately," she said. "You'll need to serve it yourself." I nodded, slipping the papers into my briefcase. My hands shook the slightest bit as I zipped it shut. Not from fear, from something else. After all the warnings, the fines, the humiliation, this was the first time I'd managed to put up a real wall between Karen and my home. And she wasn't going to like it. I didn't wait. I walked straight to the HOA office, which Karen had conveniently set up in her own garage. She liked to call it the Community Affairs Center, complete with tasteful signage and manicured flower beds. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I marched up the driveway, past one of her private security guards, and knocked on the door until she answered. When she saw me standing there with a thick manila envelope in hand, her expression didn't flicker. But when I handed her the papers and said the words, "Temporary injunction, filed this morning, effective immediately," the tightness around her mouth betrayed her. She read the first page quickly, flipping through as if she could will it to say something different. "This isn't valid," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You can't do this." "I already did," I said. "And if you violate that order, the next person you'll be talking to isn't me." For a moment, I thought she might actually tear the papers in half, right there on her porch. But Karen was too controlled for that. Instead, she smiled tightly and stepped back, as if she were granting me mercy. "This is temporary," she said. "You know that." I met her gaze without blinking. Sometimes temporary is all you need. As I walked away, I heard her door slam hard enough to rattle the glass. The demolition was halted, for now. But I knew Karen wasn't finished, and neither was I. The day of the hearing, the county courthouse was buzzing with the usual background noise. Heels on tile, papers shuffling, murmured conversations. But all of it faded the moment I stepped into that courtroom. This wasn't just about saving my house anymore. It was about exposing Karen for what she was. She arrived exactly on time, not a second too soon or too late. She walked in like she owned the place, flanked by 2 lawyers in tailored suits. They carried sleek leather briefcases and talked in low voices, giving off the air of men who had already won. Karen wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than I'd paid to restore my front porch. Her heels clicked with precision as she took her seat, her smile just a little too smug. But I wasn't worried. When the judge called us to order, Ben was already at my side, the easement documents neatly arranged in front of him. We made our case without theatrics, just facts. Ben walked the court through the history of the property, the easement agreement, the protected status, the explicit restrictions against demolition without city approval. Every word was backed by certified copies from City Hall. Karen's lawyers countered with their usual song and dance about community standards and public safety. They tried to paint me as an unreasonable homeowner, refusing to comply with HOA rules, but the judge didn't seem moved. And then we dropped the next piece, the forged signatures. Ben laid out the discrepancies, presenting the mismatched signatures from the board's official records compared to the notices they'd issued. He backed it up with affidavits from 2 board members who had finally broken ranks. They swore they hadn't signed half of what Karen claimed they had. That got the judge's attention. Karen shifted in her chair, her hand flexed around the armrest, her knuckles pale against the leather. For the first time, she wasn't smiling. When Ben moved on to the HOA's financials, specifically the missing funds and consulting fees funneled directly into Karen's personal accounts, there wasn't a sound in the room except for Ben's voice and the scratch of the judge's pen. By the end of it, Karen's lawyers looked less certain, their polished confidence cracking under the weight of the evidence. The judge leaned forward, tapping his pen once on the desk. "Demolition is halted indefinitely pending further investigation." Karen didn't look at me as she left the room, but I could feel her fury trailing behind her like smoke. A week after the hearing, the ruling came down. I stood in my living room, hands braced on the old wooden window frame, staring out at the street as the courier pulled away from the curb. The envelope in my hands felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of everything I'd been through was packed inside. I took a deep breath and opened it. The language was formal, full of legal precision, but the message was clear. The court ruled in my favor. The easement stood. The historic status of my property was reaffirmed, and any action to demolish, alter, or otherwise interfere with my home without city approval was strictly prohibited. The HOA had no authority over me. Not now, not ever. I exhaled slowly, letting the relief wash over me for the first time in months. But as I kept reading, I realized the victory was bigger than just me. The judge had ordered a formal investigation into the Willow Bend HOA's operations, specifically its president, Karen Thompson. The evidence of forged signatures, fraudulent liens, and financial misappropriation had triggered not just a county-level review, but a criminal probe. Words like fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of authority filled the pages. Karen was officially under investigation. I imagined her sitting in that pristine white kitchen of hers, staring at papers she couldn't explain and accounts she couldn't hide. I imagined her face when she realized that the power she'd wielded for so long had finally slipped through her fingers. Outside, her security fence was already being taken down. The same contractors who'd measured my house for demolition were now rolling up caution tape and loading steel posts into their trucks. They didn't make eye contact as they worked. I didn't need them to. Neighbors had begun to reappear too. Some waved as they passed. A few offered tentative smiles, as if unsure whether to celebrate or keep their distance. But I saw something in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Respect, maybe. Gratitude. I slid the court papers back into their envelope and set them on my desk. The house was quiet around me. the way it had been before Karen had turned my life upside down. I ran my hand along the smooth curve of the banister I'd restored myself and whispered to no one in particular, "You're safe now." And I meant it. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. A week after the ruling, the neighborhood buzzed with news that Karen had resigned as HOA president. Officially, they said she was stepping back to focus on personal matters. Unofficially, everyone knew she'd been forced out. The board couldn't protect her anymore, not with county investigators knocking on doors and subpoenas flying out like confetti. I watched from my porch as the movers hauled out box after box from Karen's house. She wasn't there to supervise. Word was, she'd already left in the middle of the night, slipping away before the full weight of what she'd done could hit her. But it was too late for running. The investigation had turned up more than anyone expected. Accounts drained of HOA funds. Phantom contractors who were nothing more than shell companies with money funneled straight into her pockets. Even falsified inspection reports that had helped her force out other homeowners who didn't fit her picture of perfection. The news spread quickly. It was all anyone talked about, first in hushed whispers, then openly. People weren't afraid anymore. One by one, the remaining board members resigned. Some claimed ignorance. Others blamed Karen directly. It didn't matter. They were all done. Without Karen propping them up, the entire structure collapsed. What had once been an iron-fisted rule turned to dust almost overnight. I got a letter from the county a few days later confirming Karen had been formally charged. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, abuse of authority. There was talk of prison time, and I didn't doubt it. She'd spent years hiding behind HOA bylaws and bureaucracy, using them like weapons. And now, there wasn't a single sheet of paper left to shield her. For the first time in a long time, Willow Bend felt different, lighter. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months crossed the street to shake my hand. Some apologized for staying quiet when things got bad. Others asked how they could help rebuild the community. Without Karen's shadow looming over us, people seemed ready to start fresh. I stood on my porch and watched the neighborhood come back to life. Kids on bikes, flower beds tended without fear of violation notices. For the first time since moving here, it felt like home again. Karen had tried to erase me. Instead, she erased herself. With Karen gone and the HOA in shambles, I finally had the space to breathe. The house, once marked for demolition, now stood like a quiet survivor. But I knew survival wasn't enough. I wanted to protect it, permanently. No more loopholes to be found and exploited by whoever came next. I wanted it untouchable. So, I filed the paperwork. It wasn't easy. The process to establish historic landmark status was long, bureaucratic, and buried under layers of red tape. But I'd learned patience through all this. Patience and persistence. I gathered the records, the original blueprints from the 1920s, photographs of the house as it stood nearly a century ago, letters from historians who vouched for its architectural significance. I even dug up newspaper articles from when the house was first built, praising it as a fine example of early craftsman design. It took months. There were inspections and hearings and endless forms. But eventually, I stood in front of the city council, easement agreement in one hand and a stack of carefully prepared documents in the other, and made my case. This house wasn't just wood and nails. It was history, and it deserved to be protected. The vote was unanimous. A month later, I mounted the small bronze plaque next to the front door. Registered Historic Landmark. The words gleamed in the afternoon sun, a quiet but undeniable shield. No HOA, now or ever, could lay claim to it. Not without crossing state and federal preservation laws. It was no longer just my home. It was officially part of the city's history. And no one, not Karen, not anyone, could rewrite that. I got back to work after that. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I repainted the trim by hand, the same deep green I'd chosen when I first moved in. I polished the old brass door fixtures and replaced the loose boards on the porch. It was quiet work, but it settled something inside me. This time, I wasn't restoring the house just for me. I was preserving it. For the people who came before me, and the ones who'd come after. When I stepped back and looked at it all finished, I finally understood. Some homes are more than just places to live. They're legacies. And this one was safe. Forever. It started with a knock on my door one Saturday morning. I opened it to find Mrs. Langley from 2 houses down, standing on my porch, holding a plate of lemon bars. She smiled nervously, as if unsure I'd even answer. We hadn't spoken much in the last year, not since Karen had started her campaign against me. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice soft, "thank you for standing up, for not giving in." Her hands trembled slightly as she handed me the plate. Most of us didn't know what to do. I invited her in for coffee, and by the time the mugs were empty, she'd told me about the fines Karen had hit her with for keeping a small garden of wildflowers instead of approved landscaping, how she'd been too afraid to fight back after receiving letters threatening legal action. She wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, the stories trickled in, one neighbor at a time. Mr. Devereux, the quiet man who worked nights, explained how Karen fined him for leaving his porch light on too late. The Rodriguez family had paid nearly $1,000 in violations because their teenage son's car wasn't aesthetically pleasing. Even the Jenkinses, who'd once defended Karen at HOA meetings, admitted she'd cornered them into silence by threatening to block their home renovation permits. They all came, slowly at first, and then more steadily, like a thaw breaking through a long winter. Some brought baked goods, others brought old photographs of their homes, proud of what they'd built before Karen tried to tear it all down. A few just wanted to shake my hand. I didn't think of myself as a hero. I hadn't done it for recognition. I'd done it because this house meant something to me, and because I couldn't stand the thought of watching someone like Karen destroy it. But standing there on my porch, listening to people tell their stories, I realized I hadn't just fought for my home. I'd fought for all of them too. And now, without Karen's shadow hanging over us, Willow Bend felt different, like a neighborhood again. Not a place ruled by fear, but a place where people lived, where they belonged. It was quiet, simple, but it was home, and that was enough. Sometimes I sit on the front porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip low behind the rooftops, casting that golden light across the street. It's quiet here now. The kind of quiet that makes you take a deep breath and realize you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The kind of quiet that had been missing for far too long. It's hard to believe how close I came to losing all of this. One piece of paper, that old easement buried in city records, was all it took to shift the balance. A simple legal loophole that Karen never saw coming. She thought she knew every rule, every inch of leverage she had over this place. She thought people like me wouldn't bother to look deeper, wouldn't fight back. She was wrong. That loophole may have saved my home, but it wasn't the paper that made the difference. It was patience, persistence, knowing when to hold your ground and when to push back. Karen underestimated me because I wasn't loud. I didn't show up to meetings with speeches or threaten lawsuits the way some did. I took my time. I let her get comfortable in her power. And then I used every piece of it against her. I think about that sometimes. How easy it is for people like her to believe they're untouchable. How they wrap themselves in rules and bylaws like armor, forgetting that laws, real laws, cut both ways. Karen lost everything because she forgot one simple truth. You can only push people so far before they push back. And sometimes, the person you think is the easiest target turns out to be the one who takes you down. Her house sits empty now, the lawn overgrown, the windows dark. It's strange to walk past it and not feel the weight of her watching from behind those curtains. Some say the county is going to seize it once the dust settles on her charges. Others say someone will buy it cheap and fix it up again. Either way, it's no longer hers, and it never will be. As for me, I'm still here. The house stands as strong as it ever did, maybe stronger, and so do I. This place is mine, and no one's ever taking it away again.